Okay, thank you. And Ms. Chu, in your summary, you skipped over one page and you intentionally skipped it over, but I want to go back to it if I could, page 6 in the booklet. And one item on page 6 talks about the fact that the governor's proposing adding agricultural vocational education to the LCFF. I know there's a lot of interest in the community and probably some folks here who want to hear more about that. How does the LAO feel about that decision by Department of Finance?
We recommend that the legislature adopt the governor's proposal to roll that in. The districts that currently receive the grants under that particular categorical program would continue to receive those monies. The money would simply count towards their overall LCFF target. So districts received grants on a statewide total of around $4 million. That money would now count towards their target LCFF allocation. They'd have discretion on how they wish to use it. They could continue to run the programs that they currently operate for agricultural vocational education. The state would just consider it a part of their overall discretionary funding.
Okay, and since it's the governor's proposal, I assume the governor supports that approach. Does the Department of Education have any position?
Actually, the superintendent does not support the proposal and would like to see the categorical kept out of the formula.
Okay, so let's note that is one thing that needs further discussion. Maybe in public comment we'll have some of that, and then in a later hearing. Thank you all on that. Let's move to Senator Weiland. Had a question?
A few. And I'd like to follow on with Mr. Chairman, that same observation. I also have great concerns about that. This takes a particular type of CTE, which is extremely important in agricultural areas, but I think there's and I agree with what the department is saying, and I think what the chair may be getting there, but CTE in general has suffered dramatically from the loss of categoricals. And without going into greater depth right now, you can make a very strong case that the absence of CTE from high schools, not sticking it in community colleges, which was done a long time ago, but in high school, which is where it used to be. Formerly, CTE was in high schools known as comprehensive high schools in California. The problem you have is those students at 14 and 15 in the high schools. That's where you get a lot of the dropout rate. And I could tell you anecdotal evidence by anecdotal evidence, talking to teachers, talking to administrators. I will tell you, if you poll 2/3 of the high school teachers in this state, they will tell you that there are a lot of wonderful students who simply don't have that interest in academic work, and what we've disrespected them. We've said, you know, that's too bad. If you don't want to study AP chemistry, you just don't have value. So many have heard me talk about this for a long time. I'll leave that. The only other thing that I have a concern about with the formula is the accountability. I don't think we're going down the right road, because we have some things that are helping, the interim regs, the template, the counties, but the bottom line is these districts are choosing or trying to do the best they can, and everyone is different. So if you look at English language learners, and that's anywhere from 1/4 to 1/3 of the 6 million students, which is greater than the entire population of 35 states. At this juncture, for 20 and 30 years, as this has been building, we do not have standard pedagogical techniques to do this. We don't have them. Now, I come from a district, it's one of the few in my district. My old school district in Escondido was one of the ones that would qualify. It's heavily Latino, heavily English language learner. Why do we, as a district of 17 or 18,000, have to try to figure out how we do that. We have San Diego next door. We have LAUSD up there. In theory, they have many more resources, but we're all on our own. And the type of chaos this is, which also applies to Common Core, bless their hearts, the LA Times actually writes a lot about this stuff. And just a few months ago, you saw the enormous debate over English language learners. And you had a part of that district where it's concentrated in East LA. You had parents and principals and schools saying, we want to go this route. But in their wisdom, and they may have greater wisdom, the central authority said no, and actually, according to the article, said if you don't get off this bandwagon, there's going to be discipline. Because, you know, they had so big, they have their local governance of smaller schools. So here we have a formula, part of which is dedicated to these kids, and I don't think there's any argument among any of us here that part of what drives the dropout rate and determines success is the ability to read for any kid. And here we are just saying, fine, take the money. And in that same article, and I'll provide copies to anyone who missed it, you have the officer, because they're so big, they have a section on research and all of that. And she said, well, you know, we're really not sure. My point would be, and of course there are other kids who struggle with reading. And my point would be, rather than I know subsidiarity, it's fine, it's nice, I like local control, but in some things, I believe we need larger control. And I'll just leave it with this, and you can look at other elements of this, but let's just look at the English language learners. You know, there are probably a dozen different scenarios. There's a scenario where I've got, in this state, Spanish-speaking students, but maybe a third of my class speak English. And they're, you know, first, second graders. That's pretty easy. There's lots of exposure to English, if that's also happening in the classroom. But then you have some, and I have it in Orange County, where you have 6 different languages. And teachers are coming out not systematically trained in pedagogical techniques that yield results. So you can find some who are doing great, some less. I'll leave it there, but that's why I proposed last year when we did this that this funding be approved by the department based on approaches where there was evidence, and you could have a standard as high as peer-reviewed journals saying this actually works.
And who would you like to respond to that or reflect on it?
It affects everybody, and
Okay, do any of you wish to-
if you would like to respond, you can. If you don't, it's okay. But I feel very strongly about it. I mean, you know, one of my first jobs.
Well, let's give the panelists a chance to comment if they wish to.
Yeah, well, if I may, I would like to respond. I think we share a lot of the same concerns. We do think the accountability model under LCFF and LCAP is on the right track because, as you said, the state's extraordinarily diverse. And so you have to have the capacity to reflect local priorities and resources. Having said that, it doesn't make any sense to reinvent the wheel 1,000 times, which I think is the frustration you're expressing. So that I just wanted to go back to the comments about the collaborative. We think there's a real opportunity there to share best practices, and then when the state develops the evaluation rubrics and you can look at a performance and say you're not making progress in some specific area, then you can start matching. You know, obviously our hope is most districts and counties would want to do that voluntarily, find the best practices, but where they start based on outcomes, and this will take several years, but when you start seeing you're falling short on outcomes, then you can start matching, you know, peer-to-peer support. So I don't want to pretend it's all there. It's all be working perfectly in July, but I think the direction of this really makes sense. And we do feel the big missing piece now, I mean, there's a lot of work ahead of us, but a big missing piece now is that collaborative, which we think has a lot of potential.
Thank you. Thank you, Senator Weiland.
Thank you. I hope that's the case, and I hope it doesn't take years. Let's do this.
Thank you. I've got a question for Mr. Birdsall, too. What are you hearing from the county soups in terms of any concerns or frustrations they're having with implementation of the formula? What's happening in the county offices, and also what are they hearing from their local districts? Are there any significant particular concerns you could share with us, both on implementation and also on the LCAP implementation?
Boy. Three jump to mind. One is obviously the funding that's proposed in the budget, which we all welcome, comes after years of cuts. So the pent-up demands just hugely outstrip the resources that are available. So trying to balance the expectations and the needs is, I'm not asking you to solve it, but that's a real dilemma. Mm-hmm. People are grappling with the size of the LCAP. On the one hand, you want it to be brief enough that it's understandable to most people. On the other hand, it needs to be detailed enough that it has meaning. And so there's a real tension there. And then the third is just so much is hitting. I mean, so all of this is, I think people overwhelmingly feel like we're going the right direction, but having said that, all this stuff is hitting at once. We're not only doing LCAP, but we're doing Common Core, we're doing the new assessment system, and so there is a level of anxiety out there that I think is warranted. But generally speaking, having said that, I think it is, people are collaborating in a way that I haven't seen in decades. It's really extraordinary.
Well, that's good to see. Now, at some point, the collaboration might move from districts and county offices working together to county offices being in the position where they're holding districts accountable with these LCAPs. If a district is not meeting its goals that have been approved by the county office and the LCAP, what are the county office's prerogatives with regard to consequences for the district for not meeting its obligations?
Yeah. Well, all of that is, I guess I can take some safety in saying that'll be defined by the board through the rubrics that are going to be adopted. But we're approaching it like the fiscal accountability system, which is it is not our expectation that we will be telling districts what to do. That would be a super extreme case. It's more asking the pointed question. You know, in the fiscal accountability model, it looks like you're going to run out of money in 3 years. What's your plan? So once the rubrics are adopted, and this is the outcome standard with regard to English learners or African American males or suspension expulsion, then the county's job would be to say either you don't seem to be making progress against that rubric, what's your plan? And it's a locally developed plan. Or you said you're going to do this, but we looked at your budget, because remember this is aligned with the budget, we looked at your budget and we don't see any money in the budget to do what you say you're going to do. And so what's your plan there? So it's more asking, I would define our role more as asking the appropriate question. As with the fiscal accountability system, if a district's really failing to meet the standards, then that actually requires the state to make the decision to intervene. And that's the way this legislation is written also. Okay, so you would say it's similar to state intervention on financial issues. Right. Under the fiscal, on financial accountability, if it, you know, we're all working to avoid a district going bankrupt, but if you get to that point, the county has to refer it to the state, and the state makes that decision. The same is true on the academic accountability. So our role is really just to apply the rubric and to, as I said, ask the appropriate question. You know, if the example I use, if the district says we're going to provide counseling for every student that's far below basic between as they transition from 8th grade to 9th grade, you look at their budget and they have funding for 1.5 counselor, that's an appropriate place to ask a question. We're not in a position to tell the district what to do, but probably is useful to ask that question.
Great, thank you. Any other questions, Senators? I have one more last question, and that deals with, we've been talking about our 8-year implementation and our targets, but even if we meet the targets, we're going to be ranked well below average in the country, maybe still in the 40s, maybe in the high 40s. I'm not sure where it will put us. It depends what other states do over the next 8 years. Are there any aspirational goals? I mean, where do we want to be in California in 8 years as compared to other states? What does the State Board of Education hope for? What do the county soups hope for? What does the Department of Education? Anyone wants to address that at all? Or have we not thought about that? I'm sure we've thought about it. So what have we thought?
Well, I'm not sure that the superintendent would think that we would be there in the next 8 years, but the superintendent's goal is to meet the goals defined in Proposition 98, that California is ranked in the top 10 of funding in the U.S. So I don't think we're, I don't think he thinks we're getting there in 8 years, but I do think that is the goal, and that's the goal as soon as possible.
Okay, thank you. Anyone else want to comment? LAO? Ms. Chu?
Sure. I would just add, Senator, that the LCFF really was a fundamental restructuring of the way we allocate the funding, and that how big that bucket is a very valuable and important discussion for the legislature to have, but one that is sort of separate from how we actually send the money out to districts. So that's just to say that I don't want to lose sight of the importance of the steps that the legislature took last year to rethink how we would allocate the funds.
Thank you. Anybody else wish to comment on that?
Sure. Chris Ferguson with Finance again. We would align ourselves with the LAO pretty closely. Largely, the LCFF was designed to address inequities in what was then the school finance system, and we think we've certainly corrected the distributional methodology for allocating funds to school districts, but it was not designed to address funding adequacy.
Those are helpful comments. I appreciate that. Mr. Birdsall?
Just a sense, we hope it leads to a system of continuous improvement. I mean, it's every year try and learn from each other and do a better job, on student outcomes.
Okay, thank you. If there are no other, oh wait, there are. Senator Liu and then Senator Weiland.
It's just my suggestion, Chairman Block, that's the role, setting a goal or a target is the role of the legislature to make sure that all of our partners in this crime get there. And I would challenge all of us to, 10%, top 10% would be a nice goal to set. That's not too high. I mean, I know that in higher ed, I've been very disappointed in our public university systems. We're kind of average in most things, and I'd like to be good at what we do. So setting some internal goals, discussions among ourselves would, maybe let the field know that this is our aspiration, and let's see if we can get there together.
And that's, I guess I have to respond. I don't think UC is kind of average. I don't know.
No, I know. No, that's how we're, but
Okay.
that's across the country, that's how we're graded. So, on various markers, but on average, that's what we
Okay.
wind up as being
All right.
our higher education system.
Thank you. Senator Weiland.
I think when you talk about funding and the equity there, LCFF is so dramatic. I don't know if there's any other funding formula in the country. There may be that ultimately during that 8-year period, and we may get there very rapidly, shifts an enormous amount of money to those districts. Now, even though my old district would qualify in both counts, and I care very much about that, the only way I'm able to explain this to my other districts, which will get none, is that their children will be better off, as we will be in this entire state, if we achieve those goals. But we have to get there. It's time to get there. I've seen this all the way back 30-some years ago when I was working on this in New York City, and we still aren't there in some of these things. And we've just got to get there, which is why that's my concern. It's time. Today, there are children in classes who are struggling to read. And whatever system we have, and I understand best practices, and I hope they share them and this and that. But my charge is let's make sure we get there and there's real accountability, because I know we can do it. And if it takes more money to do it, I'm happy to support more money to do it, as long as we achieve it. So, thank you.
Thank you, Senator. And with that, I would thank and dismiss this panel, and we'll now move to public comment. Let the panelists get out first, and then we'll have the line form up here. And I'd ask those wishing to make public comment to take the 4 seats here in the center and just keep rotating as you finish. And I will ask those making public comment to always introduce themselves, and if they represent an organization, tell us what organization you represent. And also, we're asking public comment to limit to about 2 minutes per comment. Less is okay, more is not. Begin over here.
Thank you, Senator Block. Fred Jones, representing the California Business Education Association. I'm going to focus my remarks entirely on career technical education. Your staff analysis does a great job on page 8 under issues to consider. The Senate raised concerns last year about the elimination of dedicated funding streams for CTE programs. What would be the impact of eliminating them? I'm here to tell you exactly what has been the impact. According to a January 5th report released by the Department of Education, I want to cite 2 statistics. In 1 year, just this last year, we have lost 100,000 enrollees in career technical education in our high schools. In just 1 year, we have lost 1/5 of our CTE instruction staff, 1/5 of our teachers. And the trends are not looking any better for next year. So those are the real effects of allowing districts to spend career tech dollars any way they want and not attach it to any type of vocational education or workforce development. Why is that? Because there's 3 drivers that determine the instructional day of every student: what the state requires, funds, and measures. And the only thing that has kept career tech in the ballgame is the categorical funding. We're not part of high school graduation mandates. We're not widely accepted for UC A through G acceptance. We're not part of the accountability system, API, assessments. Common Core now has come out and admitted they don't have a career readiness element. So we will not be able to assess for career tech. So unless we're part of those drivers, we're dead. And so we would really encourage the legislature to look at an accountability funding stream for career technical education. And finally, let me just say this. The LCAP is no answer. I went to my first LCAP hearing Monday night at my county, Placer. There were 3 parents there. One of them was my wife, and the other one was me, and one of our close friends. Staff had their own recommendations. There wasn't anything about vocational education on their list. So don't tell us we can count on locals to prioritize career tech. Don't tell us that administrators will prioritize it, because it's not part of the policy drivers. So please hold districts accountable for spending career tech dollars on career tech programs. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
Mr. Chairman, members, Steve Henderson with the California School Employees Association, here representing the Education Coalition. I'm here with my colleague Jeff Vaca, and we just kind of like to talk to you a little bit about the budget and some of our priorities. I think the discussion towards the end was a very important discussion. You talked about adequacy. And while we have transparency and flexibility and accountability, we still need adequacy. Let us not forget, when we stepped off the cliff and we were involved in the Great Depression, schools were cut $20 billion. We were fortunate that the voters voted on Prop 30, but don't forget, Prop 30 saved us from an additional $6 billion in cuts, which would have devastated education. So to that end, let's not forget that the money that we are providing through Prop 30 to fund the LCFF, even if all those districts get funded, which we hope they will, we are still going back to a standard that was an 07-08 standard, and even then we were, I believe, 47th in the nation with respect to funding. I think there was a good question about what do we aspire to. We in the Ed Coalition think we should aspire to at least the average of the top 10 states in per pupil funding. Mr. Weiland, I was so appreciative to hear you say if we need money, you're willing to support it, because we need money. So let's get some support out there for it. We appreciate that. With respect to our other priorities, of course, the Ed Coalition always advocates for maintaining the integrity of Prop 98. And to that end, we appreciate that the governor has provided $9.7 billion towards funding the LCFF. We hope that we can get that money out there and get it quickly so that we can fund the districts and get them up to their targets before the 8-year implementation period that we're talking about. We as the Ed Coalition oppose any action which would in any way reduce the Prop 98 guarantee. And so to that end, we just want to remind the committee that there's some proposals out there with respect to the facilities funding, which would have debt costs be borne by Prop 98. We would be in opposition to that. There are also conversations out there with respect to STRS funding, which would have Prop 98 bear costs related to that. We would be opposed to that as well. And with that, I'd like to turn it over to my colleague, Jeff Vaca.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair and members. Jeff Vaca with the California Association of School Business Officials, and also representing today the Education Coalition. With respect to additional priorities of the coalition, restoration of the state's obligations to K-12 education, a historical position of the coalition, including the deferrals, the unpaid mandate claims, as well as the Proposition 98 maintenance factor. We're continuing to have conversations about the timing and the mix of such things as deferrals and mandate claims, but we are in full agreement that those need to be retired before the end of the Proposition 30 temporary revenues. We support the governor's proposal of $4.5 billion dedicated to the local control funding formula. We support the governor's proposal, $188 million, with respect to the emergency repair program. We're continuing to have a lot of conversations about the Proposition 98 reserve. We're withholding a formal position until we've had a chance to actually examine the language. But we do have a lot of questions. And I think primary among those questions is, does the concept of a 98 reserve make sense in the context of the issue that you raised, Senator Block, with respect to having an aspirational goal? Will that help or hinder our efforts to get there? And we just don't know until we've had a chance to look at that language. Common Core, we are in agreement that there will be additional funds needed for Common Core. Our colleagues with the Association of California School Administrators are currently undertaking a survey of their members to determine not just what the needs are, but how some of the funds that already allocated have been spent, and we anticipate sharing that information with you at a later hearing. And then a historical position of the coalition, major policy changes within trailer bill language. An example being independent study, online education. We believe that those should be heard in a policy committee and have a full hearing with discussion and consideration of all the issues associated with those important policy items. Thank you.
Thank you. Next.
My name is Jim Ashwin. I'm the Executive Director of the California Agricultural Teachers Association. Appreciate your comments regarding ag education and the interest in it. We obviously are well prepared to discuss our concerns in honor of honoring the intent of this hearing. We did not bring students today. We have them in the building. They were willing to come, but because of the overview nature of this hearing, we would love to have a date at some point that devotes some time to career tech. I noticed you mentioned earlier might do that on Common Core. I would really think that it would be appropriate to do that for career tech. Just a couple of things regarding ag education since it came up. LAO and DOF both cite that there would be this kind of transfer from a categorical into the base and that would count. What they haven't mentioned is that there's no adjustment to the target for those districts. And so at the end of the day, those targets are reached and the add-on disappears. And so ultimately, the impact is that current funding for ag education then gets spread throughout the base and there is no add-on and there's no adjustment. So obviously those kinds of issues we'd like to share a lot more information about. What I really wanted to comment today about, though, was it isn't that often that we get to hear philosophies from the 10,000-foot level from LAO and Department of Finance and already have evidence that the reality is not the same as their perception. And if you look at the data that was presented to you regarding career tech enrollments in California, you know, it's fine to have a philosophy that you can drop a dozen eggs from 10,000 feet and that none of them will hit the ground. It's an interesting situation for us in career tech to be on the ground level of reality and be standing in an omelet already. And so we need to have a thoughtful discussion about what has occurred to career tech. We are in a death spiral. And if we don't follow up on the caution that the Senate used last year, which it was entirely justified based on what we're already seeing happen, it's just going to get worse. And so I would suggest that we devote some time to this, really have a thoughtful discussion about what we're seeing already in the field. As one of the speakers earlier said, we are, based on what we're seeing already, the 101,000 students we lost last year and the 19.6% of the teachers we lost, we're well on our path to do that again this year. And so that's very fearful. Finally, I would like to address your aspiration question. Career Tech and Ag Education would like to get back to 2006 funding levels because there has not been a recognition that those programs were all cut 20% at that juncture. And what we're talking about is the loss of what's left. We're being asked to do a lot, and we're not getting the resources.
Okay, thank you very much. I'd like to remind speakers, try to keep your comments to 2 minutes and fill in the empty seats. We'll go back to the right side of the table.
Hi, Mr. Chair and members. Nicole Rice, California Manufacturers and Technology Association. We're here also to echo our support for career tech education and training. Want to piggyback on some of the things that Mr. Jones described. He laid out the landscape and described it well of where we are with career tech education and funding in the state, and it's really distressing to hear from employers' perspective. We appreciate the discussion and the recognition that there needs to be something done with career tech education. We would even submit that you don't have to throw out the concept of LCFF in order to achieve the objective of career tech education and maintaining that as a robust part of California's education opportunities for all students. But we do recommend and suggest that it needs to be a targeted investment, as Mr. Jones said, with accountability so that those dollars are actually being used on skills training, relevant industry-related skills training, where kids are getting a hands-on opportunity to learn the skill that's necessary for the economies of the state. As an industry that relies heavily on skilled workers, we're starting to see our current workforce retire out. So we're going to need to be able to fill those jobs in the future. And so this education opportunity is very important for us. It's not just an education issue for us as an industry, it's an economic issue. And we think that it complements the ability to fund that and create that pipeline 9 through 12, and we would submit even going as far back as 8th grade, actually complements the priorities that the state has set in other areas related to workforce development. So again, as I said, I don't think that we have to abandon where the state wants to go for its education financing priorities in order to save career tech education. I think that they complement each other. The priorities that are already being done, the state needs to continue with that statewide policy to protect those resources and to move forward with their workforce development agenda. And we submit those comments, and thank you for this opportunity.